Before going into the Hiss defense, I want to discuss an issue that, when all was said and done, did not figure large in the case. It was, however, constantly making itself felt backstage, rustling the curtains, threatening to rush out into the footlights and upset everything. And the issue is homosexuality. Remember, we're talking about revelations of homosexuality not today, but in 1949. It was unmentionable in polite society. Men still went to jail for homosexual acts. Conservatives thought it was a sin and a crime, and many caring liberals thought that it was a mental illness for which shock treatment or even frontal lobotomies were the best medicine. When ex-communists came forward and began naming names, it was commonplace practice for the party to smear them as sex perverts, in addition to being alcoholics or having, God forbid, talked to a psychiatrist. And some people thought that Hiss was doing this when, before HUAC, he said that Chambers' life was not like those of normal men, an open book, and when he described Chambers' story 4 times as somewhat queer. Hiss may have also been hinting at the same thing when he began identifying Chambers as George Crosley. For George Crosley was a name that Chambers had indeed used as a pen name or nom de plume in the 1920s. And some of Chambers' poems that were published in the 20s were, by the standards of that day, obscene, and in at least one case, homosexual. So when Hiss said George Crosley to Chambers for the first time in the Commodore Hotel, he may have been sending Chambers a little signal through the air that we've been looking into your background and we found out your dirty little secret, and if you keep telling what you know about me, we'll start telling what we know about you, and it's going to hurt like the dickens. Such threats would have been terrible for Chambers, and as one historian said, this may explain the sense of dread that he seems to have felt all through the case and makes his attempted suicide more understandable. Please note, the Hiss defense not only prefigured Joe McCarthy and his anti-communism, but they tried to use homosexuality against Chambers too. In the same vein, an article in the Communist Party's Daily Worker, which Chambers was once the managing editor of, once described Chambers as a small, pudgy man with effeminate manners. Standards for political correctness have changed. Well, let's move ahead a few months. You're the FBI, and you're helping Prosecutor Murphy prepare his case, and you're talking every day with Chambers, getting him to remember, if he can, everything, all the little details about what he did with Hiss, and seeing if you can get any proof that it actually happened. You know he's going to be your star witness. You also know he's got a lot of vulnerabilities. He's a former communist, a confessed traitor, a confessed perjurer, recently 16 times about the facts of this case, and if not insane, a man who seems rather addicted to melodrama. Well, at the end of your meeting with him one day, February 15, 1949, Chambers gets up to go, gives you a written statement, and leaves the room. And you read the statement, and it says what I'm about to say. We have now reached a point in my testimony where I must testify to certain facts which should be told only to a priest. Alger Hiss's defense obviously intends to press the charge that I have had homosexual relations with certain individuals. I did not know what homosexualism meant until I was more than 30 years old. Until then, some of my friendships with men were too intense, but they were completely innocent. My relations with women were slow to develop, but were normal. In 1933 or 4, a young fellow stopped me on the street in New York and asked me if I could give him a meal and lodgings for the night. I fed him, and he told me about his life as a miner's son. I was footloose, so I took him to a hotel to spend the night. There, he presently taught me an experience I did not know existed. At the same time, he revealed to me and unleashed the tendency of which I was still unaware. It was a revelation to me. As a matter of fact, it set off a chain reaction in me which was almost impossible to control. Because it had been repressed so long, it was all the more violent when once set free. For 3 or 4 years, I fought a wavering battle against this affliction. Continuing up to the year 1938, I engaged in numerous homosexual activities in both New York and Washington, D.C. I never had any prolonged affair with any one man and never visited any known places where these types of people were known to congregate. I'm positive that no man with whom I had these relations ever knew my true identity, nor do I at this time recall the names of any of them. 10 or more years ago, with God's help, I absolutely conquered it. This does not mean that I am completely immune to such stimuli. It does mean that my self-control is complete, and that for years I have lived a blameless and devoted life as husband and father. At no time did I have such relations, or even the thought of such relations, with Hiss or with anybody else in the Communist Party, or connected with communist work of any kind. I kept my secret jealously. I tell it now only because in this case I stand for truth. Having mercilessly testified against others, it has become my function to testify mercilessly against myself. I've said before that I am consciously destroying myself. This is not from love of self-destruction, but because only if we are consciously prepared to destroy ourselves in the struggle can the thing we are fighting be destroyed. Well, if you're the FBI, doesn't this case just keep getting better and better? Your star witness was already a communist, a traitor, a multiple perjurer, and now he's a pervert too. This statement did not come out of the trials. It became public in the 70s. Let's shift over to the Hiss defense. Let's say you're the Hiss defense. Something on the same subject came into their hands. A man named Leon Harold Srabian came to the defense lawyers and offered to testify roughly as follows. I knew Whittaker Chambers from the 1920s. If it matters, I was a Communist Party member until around 1937. In 1932, I attended a meeting in Chicago of the John Reed Club, which was an organization of writers and artists that was closely linked to the Communist Party. I was staying at a cheap rooming house. One night I woke up in bed to find myself in the middle of having an orgasm. A man was crouched over me, laboring at my penis still in his mouth. I was utterly revolted by this and shooed the man away. The man sat crouched in a corner of the room for over an hour, begging me to allow him to resume. I said no, and eventually the man slinked off into the night. The man was Whittaker Chambers. I'm absolutely certain about the identification. If you are the Hiss defense, do you call Srabian as a witness? Do you smear Chambers as a homosexual, a man who's therefore not worthy of belief on any subject? As I think I mentioned earlier, one of Hiss's lawyers spun out a theory that Chambers must have lusted after the handsome Hiss, or maybe even propositioned him, and then when Hiss spurned him, he stewed and sulked and brought forth false accusations years later. Perhaps the first question the Hiss defense asks is, do we really believe this thing in Chicago actually happened? Does it sound plausible to you? There's some evidence that Chambers was at that meeting of the John Reed Club, but I find the story a little dubious. Not incredible, but dubious. There's several aspects of it that are rather hard to believe. First, from what we know of Chambers' secret communist life, 99% of it occurred between New York and Washington. It would have been unusual, not out of the question, but unusual for him to be in Chicago. Second, I believe that at the time of this incident, Chambers had joined the underground. And when you joined the underground, you stopped going, you disappeared from the open party. They even moved you to a different city, often. Sometimes they even denounced you as a Trotskyite or something like that to explain your disappearance from open party activities. The John Reed Club was practically a part of the open Communist Party. It would have been a breach of normal procedure, again, not impossible, but unusual for Chambers, when he was in the underground, to attend what amounted to an open communist activity. Third, the Communist Party's attitude towards homosexuality was one of complete hostility. The party considered homosexuality to be a symptom of last gasp, decadent, late-stage capitalism that would disappear along with greed and unhappiness once the workers' dictatorship was established. It would have been incredibly risky, not impossible, but incredibly risky for Chambers to have had gay sex with someone who knew him as a fellow party member. He would have risked blackmail and exposure. Exposure would have been very dangerous for someone like Chambers, for whom the party was his whole life. I'm not saying I'd bet my last dollar this incident didn't happen. Lust makes people engage in risky behavior. but it seems rather unlikely to me. Finally, there's something basic about the story that's implausible. He says that he awoke from a deep sleep when he was in the middle of an orgasm. I don't know about you, but if I were in a hotel room and a stranger came into my room, climbed into bed with me, and began performing oral sex, I think I would wake up pretty quickly. Maybe I'm just a light sleeper, but maybe this part of the story is Srabian's way to say, I absolutely am certain it's Chambers. It's not that I saw him in a dark park for 2 seconds. He was in my hotel room for half an hour, but I'm not one of those people. It's a little too convenient, I think. Well, the Hiss defense ultimately decided not to call this witness and not to make an explicit gay smear against Chambers, but for other reasons. I think one reason was their practice that only the top people will be witnesses for the Hiss defense. And here's a guy who was a Communist Party member who stays in cheap hotels. And now there was a long string of thought that begins with the defense being afraid that the jury would think that Hiss himself was gay. Suspicions that he was gay began early. I've never seen a scrap of evidence that he was. He is, however, the kind of person that a lot of people think is gay. He's a thin, unmuscular, urban brain worker. He went to elite universities. He's one of those striped pants cookie pushers in the State Department, married to a strong woman. His hobby is bird watching, though I have to spell it out. Chambers may have added to these rumors when he said that Hiss walked with a slight mince sometimes and had rather long, delicate fingers. The Hiss defense was afraid that if it were proved that Chambers was gay, the jury would say, we always knew Hiss was one of those guys. Now it turns out Chambers is. That explains the friendship. This odd couple. There was a sexual attraction. That's the missing piece of the puzzle that Dean Acheson was talking about. And gee, I guess when Alger wants his man meat, he doesn't go to the Harvard Club, he goes way down market. And the Hiss defense was afraid that if it were proved that Chambers was a sex pervert, as the saying went in 1939, the jury would think that what happened was that the two men met as sexual partners. Maybe there was some affection, maybe it was just a chemical explosion. But then either Chambers sweet-talked Hiss into giving him the State Department documents, or Chambers blackmailed Hiss into giving him the State Department documents. Now, if you're the Hiss defense, do you want the jury to think that? On the one hand, on the positive side, it makes Hiss look less like a traitor and more like, by the standards of that time, a flawed human being, maybe sympathetic as the victim of blackmail. But the problem is that if that's what happened, Hiss is guilty. If that's what happened, he did pass government documents to Chambers in 1937 and 1938 without authorization. This would be one place where the absence of any mention from communism or treason in the indictment comes back to hurt Hiss. In the end, the Hiss defense decided not to call Srabian as a witness and not to smear Chambers explicitly as gay. I think they figured we could cover Chambers with mud, but some of it might splash back on Alger, and the whole issue is just too unpredictable. Another way that homosexuality could have risen openly, but did not in this case, is that Mrs. Hiss's son, by her first marriage, was homosexual. And not long before the case began, this fellow was discharged from the Navy on emotional grounds related to being gay. And the FBI visited him and his friends. And he says that was an implicit threat to out him, which would have been very painful for him in 1949 and perhaps painful for his stepfather's defense. Now, this guy says that he wanted to testify for his stepfather, but the defense lawyers wouldn't call him because they were afraid that his homosexuality would be exposed. And remember, only the top people testifies for the Hiss defense. And he says that he would have testified consistently with his parents' testimonies that their relationship with Chambers Crosley was businesslike, unpleasant, and brief, and he is certain that his testimony would have made a difference, he said, in the trials. I have two reflections on this. I doubt very much that anything he said would have helped very much. I've seen witnesses give exculpatory testimony for family members that was clearly sincere and laughably incredible. Family members testifying in favor of other family members in very general terms has little credibility. It's a kind of dog bites man story. Also, this stepson testified to the grand jury, and the grand jury still charged us with perjury. My second reason for doubting the testimony's value is that at the time Chambers was coming by the house to pick up documents, he did that at about 6 o'clock. He would drop them off at 10 o'clock in the evening or later. At this time, the stepson, and supposedly the two families went on trips together. At this time, the stepson was, I think, 10 or 11 years old. And I've asked myself, how much do I remember about my parents' social life when I was 10 or 11? And the answer is practically nothing. The people I remember are the people who were there when I was 5 and 15 and, you know, best friends over decades and family members. It is entirely possible that my parents had a friend when I was 9, 10, or 11 and who dropped by once a week or once every 2 weeks. When he came by the first time, I was watching the Mickey Mouse Club, and when he came by the second time, it was way past my bedtime, and maybe they took a few trips together, and it's completely escaped my memory. Finally, I doubt that this guy could have explained how 64 pages of spy documents got typed on his home typewriter. So all in all, the ways that homosexuality came up in this case but did not come out in public, I think are a fascinating example of how complex cases unfold and how some things do not come out in court. It also shows, in my opinion, how much healthier our society is today when homosexuality is not a secret shame, cannot be used to ruin somebody's credibility as a witness, and is not a subject of blackmail. We are a better country for that. And I'll have a fair amount to say more at the end about what else did not come out in court. In the next video, we get back to the trial. The Hiss defense begins its case, and Alger Hiss takes the stand.